Imagine a courtroom where justice doesn't just come from law books but from lived experience, where the man in the judge's chair understands the streets, the struggles, and the consequences of bad choices because he once lived that life himself, and that is exactly where the story of Judge Mathis begins. Not as a symbol of privilege but as a walking contradiction to the idea that your past defines your future, because long before television cameras and national respect, Judge Greg Mathis was a troubled teenager growing up in Detroit, surrounded by crime, instability, and anger, a young man who found himself in constant trouble with the law, arrested, directionless, and written off by society as just another statistic, until one turning point changed everything. A moment when instead of condemnation he encountered accountability mixed with belief, pushing him toward education, self-reflection, and eventually the law itself. And this transformation became the foundation of everything he later stood for on the bench, because when Judge Mathis speaks to defendants, he isn't lecturing from a place of distance. He is talking as someone who knows exactly how easy it is to fall and how hard it is to climb back up. And when his courtroom show began, many expected entertainment, raised voices, and dramatic rulings, but what they got instead was a rare mix of firmness, humor, compassion, and truth. Because Judge Mathis never hesitates to call out lies, irresponsibility, or excuses. Yet in the same breath he offers guidance, second chances, and real-world advice that hits harder than any fine, and case after case revealed the same pattern. People walked in defensive and angry but left reflective, sometimes embarrassed, sometimes grateful, because his judgments weren't just about money disputes. They were about personal growth, accountability, and respect. And what made Judge Mathis different from other television judges was that his authority didn't come from arrogance, it came from credibility. From a life story that mirrored the very people standing before him and outside the courtroom. His impact extended even further, dedicating time and resources to mentoring youth, speaking against systemic injustice, and reminding communities that mistakes do not make someone disposable. And even when critics tried to label his style as harsh or overly dramatic, supporters pointed out that his bluntness was rooted in care. Because sometimes the truth needs to be allowed to be heard. And over the years, Judge Mathis became more than a TV personality. He became a cultural figure representing redemption, discipline, and the power of personal responsibility, a living example that justice doesn't have to be cold to be firm, and that authority doesn't have to erase empathy. And as his courtroom stories continued to reach millions, his message remained consistent: that no matter where you start, the choices you make next can change everything. Turning Judge Mathis not just into a judge people watch, but one they listen to, learn from, and remember long after the case is closed. As the journey of Judge Mathis continued beyond the television courtroom, part 2 of his story revealed how his influence quietly reshaped lives in ways cameras could never fully capture. Because while viewers saw sharp rulings and memorable lectures, behind the scenes he was investing time, money, and credibility into communities that had long been ignored. Funding scholarships, supporting legal aid programs, and mentoring young people who reminded him of his own troubled past. And this commitment wasn't symbolic, it was personal. Driven by the belief that intervention at the right moment can redirect an entire future. And over time his courtroom philosophy became clearer. He wasn't interested in humiliating people for ratings, he was interested in breaking cycles of irresponsibility, entitlement, and self-destruct, which is why his reactions often felt intense. Because he treated every case as a teachable moment. Not just for the litigants but for millions watching at home. And as the show grew in popularity, so did the criticism. Some accused him of being too harsh, too outspoken, too emotional, but Judge Mathis never softened his stance, responding that politeness without truth helps no one, and that real respect sometimes requires confrontation. And what made this stance powerful was consistency, because whether the person before him was young or old, struggling or successful, he demanded accountability equally. reinforcing the idea that excuses don't change outcomes, choices do. And over the years, countless guests returned to thank him, crediting his words for pushing them back to school, into work, or out of destructive relationships, stories rarely broadcast but deeply real. And as society began having deeper conversations about justice reform, Judge Mathis's voice carried weight. Not as a theorist but as someone who had been both a defendant and a judge. Someone who understood the emotional cost of bad decisions and the transformative power of guidance, and even as television trends shifted, his relevance didn't fade. Because his message wasn't tied to entertainment, it was tied to truth, discipline, and redemption. And by the time his legacy was discussed, it became clear that Judge Mathis was never just resolving small claims on screen. He was modeling a form of justice that speaks directly to human behavior, one that believes people can change but only if they are honest with themselves, making his story not just about success, but about responsibility earned, lessons learned, and impact that continues long after the courtroom doors close. By the time Part 3 of Judge Mathis's story unfolded, it became clear that his greatest impact was not measured by television ratings or viral courtroom moments but by the long-term cultural shift he helped create around accountability and second chances. Because as new generations discovered his work through clips and reruns, the message remained timeless, that authority does not have to be disconnected from reality, and justice does not have to ignore human struggle. And this relevance was tested when social conversations around policing, courts, and systemic inequality intensified, placing Judge Mathis in a unique position. One where his lived experience gave him credibility few public figures could claim, and instead of retreating from controversy, he leaned into dialogue, openly discussing how anger, poverty, and lack of guidance push people toward mistakes, while still emphasizing that hardship does not excuse harm, a balance that earned both praise and criticism, yet solidified his role as a voice of realism rather than ideology. And as his career matured, he began focusing more on legacy, encouraging young lawyers and judges to understand the communities they serve, warning that power without empathy creates resentment, and empathy without discipline creates chaos. And this philosophy echoed through his courtroom style, firm, direct, sometimes loud, but always purposeful. And when reflecting on his own past, he never softened the truth, openly admitting that without intervention he could have ended up lost to the system he now represented. A reminder that justice systems are not separate from society but shaped by the people within them. And as time passed, Judge Mathis became less of a television personality and more of a reference point, cited in discussions about restorative justice, mentorship, and the importance of role models who speak honestly about consequences. And even when his show approached its later years, the influence remained strong, because viewers didn't just watch to be entertained, they watched to understand behavior, responsibility, and growth. And in the end, Judge Mathis's story stood as proof that transformation is possible, that respect is earned through consistency, and that justice, when delivered with truth and humanity together, has the power not just to punish, but to change lives. As Part 4 of Judge Mathis's story comes into focus, the conversation shifts from who he was and what he did to why his presence mattered so deeply in a world increasingly skeptical of authority. Because by this stage his courtroom had become more than a set. It was a mirror reflecting society's daily conflicts, broken trust, misplaced anger, and the constant struggle between excuses and responsibility. And what separated Judge Mathis from many figures of power was his refusal to pretend neutrality meant silence. He understood that judges influence behavior not only through rulings but through tone, honesty, and moral clarity, which is why he spoke directly to issues like disrespect, entitlement, and self-sabotage without hiding behind legal language. And as audiences matured alongside the show, many realized they weren't just watching small claims disputes. They were watching lessons about adulthood, relationships, and consequences play out in real time. And this educational role became even more important as younger viewers, often without strong guidance systems, saw someone who looked like them, spoke their language, and still demanded better from them. And despite changing media trends and shorter attention spans, Judge Mathis's approach never diluted, because his authority wasn't built on theatrics but on lived truth. And even when moments from his courtroom went viral for raised voices or sharp words, context always revealed the same core principle: that respect is non-negotiable and growth begins with accountability. And as discussions about legacy emerged, it became clear that Judge Mathis had quietly redefined what a public judge could represent. Not distant power, but earned authority; not perfection, but progress. And as his journey continued beyond the screen, his impact remained rooted in the same belief that changed his own life years ago: that one honest conversation, delivered at the right moment, can redirect a person's entire future, making his story not just the end of a series, but an ongoing lesson in justice, discipline, and the possibility of change. As the final chapter of Judge Mathis's story unfolds, it becomes clear that his true legacy was never confined to a television set or a courtroom desk, but lived in the mindset he challenged and reshaped over decades. Because by the time audiences reached this last stage of his journey, they had witnessed not just a judge resolving disputes, but a man consistently proving that transformation is possible when truth, discipline, and opportunity intersect. And what made this ending powerful was that it did not feel like a conclusion at all, but rather continuation of a philosophy that had already taken root in millions of minds. One that rejected victimhood without denying hardship, one that demanded responsibility without erasing compassion, and one that understood justice as a tool for correction rather than mere punishment. And as discussions around his career grew deeper, critics and supporters alike began to agree on one thing: that Judge Mathis represented something rare, an authority figure who did not pretend to be untouched by failure, who openly acknowledged his past mistakes not as a marketing tool but as a warning and a lesson, reminding people that poor choices carry real consequences but do not have to define the rest of a life. And this honesty gave weight to every word he spoke on the bench, because when he demanded accountability, it did not come from judgment alone. It came from experience. And as the years passed, stories quietly surfaced from former litigants who described how a few intense minutes in his courtroom lingered in their minds for years, influencing how they treated others, handled conflict, or took responsibility for their actions. Moments that never made it on screen but formed the invisible impact of his work and beyond. Individual stories. His influence extended into culture itself, shaping how audiences viewed courtroom authority, especially in communities where trust in the legal system was fragile. Because Judge Mathis did not present justice as an unreachable force, he presented it as something human, flawed, but capable of fairness when guided by integrity. And this approach mattered deeply at a time when public confidence in institutions was wavering, offering an alternative vision where firmness and empathy could coexist without weakening each other. And as younger generations encountered his work through digital platforms, they connected not just with the drama but with the underlying message: that respect is earned through behavior, not demanded through status. And that excuses may explain actions, but never erase consequences. And in many ways, this message became his final gift: a framework for personal accountability that applied far beyond courtrooms into relationships, careers, and everyday decisions. And when conversations turned to what his career ultimately stood for, the answer was never simple fame or longevity, but consistency. The consistency of values applied regardless of who stood before him, rich or poor, confident or defensive, truthful or dishonest. And this consistency reinforced a lesson often missing in society: that fairness is not about softness, and strength is not about cruelty. And as the spotlight gradually shifted away from weekly episodes to reflection and analysis, Judge Mathis's story settled into its most meaningful form, not as entertainment history, but as a case study in leadership rooted in accountability, showing that authority gains legitimacy when it speaks plainly and listens honestly. And even as the show reached its final stretch, the relevance